Yay. There we go. Once I actually did an entire workshop and I forgot to press record. So I
Oh
had to
no.
redo the entire thing to myself immediately afterwards and record it to send it out to everybody. So I'm paranoid now. So there we go. Managed to remember this time. So, right, let's get started. Hang on, I'm just going to mute everybody. But I totally failed to market this one properly. So there's a few more booked on, but not loads more. So I think it's going to be quite a nice small group, which I actually quite like. So that's good. So we're going to be making a piped cushion today. So it's a bit of a step on because it's sewing with a zip, and we're doing bias binding and piping and things like that as well. So as I go through, if there's anything that isn't quite clear, you've got any questions, please just stop and ask me. I think you've all been before. I think I recognise everybody. Anne, you're sewing along. That's exciting. I can see. That's great. Is anybody else sewing along? No, not really. Okay. Right. So what I'll do first. So first of all, then I can't remember if I've told everybody what you need. I'll zip through that first. I've got a workbook that accompanies this as usual as well, so I'll send that to everybody. So you need for your fabric. So I think it's easier to use quite a nice stable fabric. I'm using a printed cotton. But a linen would work well, like a light chambray cotton would work well. Nothing too silky, certainly nothing with stretch. And at the moment, nothing too thick as well. You need to cut 2 squares out of your fabric, the same size, and the squares need to be 3 centimeters each way larger than what you want your finished cushion to be. So I suggested a 40 centimeter square cushion, meaning that you would need to cut out 2 43 centimeter squares of fabric. But if you'd like a 50 centimeter square cushion, you can cut out 53 centimeter squares, or if you want a rectangle rather than a square, you just need to add 3 centimeters onto each of the dimensions to allow for 1.5 centimeter seam allowance down each side. So that's step 1. So you need your fabric. Obviously, you need sewing scissors and a ruler, something maybe to mark the fabric as well. And then to go around the outside for the piping, we need some piping cord. I prefer woven piping cord. Can you see that piping cord is woven rather than twisted? I think that the woven piping cord, sometimes you can see the twist of twisted piping cord through the bias binding, whereas if you manage to get the woven one, that doesn't happen quite so much. So if you can get hold of the woven one, that's good. Piping cord comes in different thicknesses, and it's completely up to you. If you want a really thin, I always think a piped cushion, the piping looks a bit like a frame around the fabric. And sometimes you might want to make a bit more of if you've got a really patterned fabric, you might want more of a sort of a muted piping cord, like piping around the edge. But sometimes you can go really jazzy and, like, I don't know, you could have like a hot pink piping around the corner or something. So it's completely up to you, but you might want to make more of a feature or less of your piping around the edge, in which case you can choose a thicker or a thinner piping cord. I think this one is a number 4, which is about in the middle. And then you need your bias binding. So I have got cotton bias binding here. This one is actually a little bit kind of crunchy, sort of stiff. The poly cotton ones are a bit smoother and a bit softer and easier to work with sometimes. You can also get satin bias binding, or you can get patterned bias, or you can make your own. I've got like a little tutorial showing you how to make your own bias binding if you'd like me to. What I'll do is I'll add that onto the email at the end. I don't have time to show that. Well, if we do it at the end, I can show it at the end. But it's basically fabric which is cut into strips about 4 centimeters wide, 4 to 5 centimeters wide, on the bias. So if you have a piece of fabric, the grain of the fabric is going vertically and horizontally. So the horizontal grain is called the weft, and the one that goes top to bottom is called the warp. And if you try and stretch a piece of fabric with the grain, it won't stretch at all because you can't stretch a straight line any further. But if I just try and stretch this on the diagonal, it's got loads of stretch. So a strip of bias binding is a strip of fabric which is cut on the diagonal or on the bias. So if you wanted to make your own, you need to get a large piece of fabric, fold it at right angles, cut along there, and then cut strips of 4 or 5 centimeters and join those. That's a quick, in a nutshell, but I've got a proper tutorial I can send you for that. So yeah, you need your bias binding as well. And then you need pins and a zipper foot, importantly. Do we just use the zipper foot? I think we do. I think we just use the zipper foot in this. They might look slightly different, but essentially, so with a regular presser foot, you have, what can I hold that against for you? Here we go. You have just hold it against my hand. Here we go. You have you have like metal down either side and then a hole in the middle for your needle to go down into. And so the metal either side is pushing down onto your fabric and holding the fabric in place. Whereas a zipper foot is the total opposite of that. Actually, that one's not as good to show you. I'll show you this one. A zipper foot has got metal in the middle and 2 holes either side. So the needle will go down either here or here. And that means so that if you're sewing a zip in place, you can make sure that your stitching goes pretty close to your zip. So you'd stitch down like this, but with it being a zipper foot, it means that you're never going to sew over the zip. You'll always be able to just keep sort of quite nice and close to your zip. If you imagine you were to do that same stitching line, but with a regular presser foot, the closest you can get, can you see, is almost off the edge of that zip. So it just wouldn't work properly. I mean, you could move your needle across, which might help a little bit, but ideally you want to be using a zipper foot. Oops, so that you can get nice and close to the teeth of the zip, and also to the piping actually as well, because that's another kind of raised thing that you want to sew nice and close up against. Okay, so you cut your fabric and then you also need your zip as well. So the zip needs to be, well, should be, I think, for nice, I like the zip to start and end just shy of the corners, because it's nice, you want to get nice neat corners on your piped cushion. So if the zip is on one side of the cushion and it's a bit short of each edge, it means you can focus on the corners and then worry about the zip afterwards. So I usually make the zip about 5 centimeters shorter than the length of the finished length of the cushion. So say you wanted a 40 centimeter square cushion at the end, you'd get a 35 centimeter long zip. And when I say that 35 centimeters, actually, I want that to be from the top of the zipper to the bottom of the zipper, not including these bits here. Now, the first thing I want to show you is how to shorten a zip, because it's a really, really handy thing to know how to do. And it means that you've always got a zip that's the right size if you can shorten it. So you can get zips really cheaply on like kind of job lots of zips sometimes online. So I think I got a bag of lots of different colors of zips for really not much at all. They're quite long, so I went for a longer size, but because I can shorten them, it means I always have a zip that's the right size. Ooh, sorry, I'm just trying to put my regular presser foot back on. So I haven't got a screwdriver, so there we go. Yes, I've always got a zip that's the right size. So what you need to do to shorten the zip, shall I use a blue one? Yeah, I will. I was going to use contrasting things. Oh, no, I want you to be able to see properly. I'm going to use a pink one. Yours will be lovely colour that coordinates with your cushion. But I'm going to use this pink one so that you can, everything stands out nice and clearly for you. So what I'm going to do is measure 35 centimetres down. Actually, no. Well, you would if you're doing, I'm doing a slightly smaller cushion because I just want it to be, I want you to be able to see it nice and clearly on the screen. So it's a bit smaller, so we'll get in frame. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I want this zip to be 22 centimetres in length. So that's shorter than what it currently is. So I'm going to start the zip up here, measure down to 22. And then I'll just pop a pin across. So I'd like to shorten my zip to this length here. I would only do this if you've got a plastic toothed zip. Most zips, you can still get metal teeth zips. They used to really all be metal, but now you can still get metal ones, but they tend to be plastic. I would only do this shortening zip technique if you're using plastic toothed zip. If you do use metal, you could do it with metal teeth, but you just have to be a lot more careful that you don't accidentally prong your needle of your sewing machine down on the metal teeth of the zip. But what we need to do is set the sewing machine to zigzag stitch, to the widest zigzag setting and the shortest stitch length. So essentially what it's going to be doing is a zigzag just in one position over the teeth quite a few times to create a new stopper. So you need to make sure that when you do it, your zip is closed so that then you can open it to where the new stopper is. So if I go over to my sewing machine, oops, take you around with me. And I'm going to set to zigzag stitch, which on this machine is number 4. I'm going to set it to the shortest length. Oops. Shortest length. So I'm going to just do 0. And then on width, I'm going to set it to number 7, which is the widest setting for the zigzag stitch on this sewing machine. And then if we pop the zip underneath the presser foot at that point where the pin is, lower the foot down, and then as usual, I'm going to do the first couple of stitches with the wheel just to make sure that everything's in the right place and that we're missing the teeth of the zip. And then when you're happy, you can just press down on the pedal a few times and then take it out. Oh. It's not very happy. I might have to rethread my sewing machine. Ooh. Have a look at that in a minute. But there we go. We've got the new stopper on your zip. So if you get a pair of scissors which are not your fabric scissors, and you can cut across the zip so that now that zip is now the length that we need it to be. Let me just quickly rethread my sewing machine because it doesn't look very pleased with me. Don't know what I've done. Right, wrong. Where are we? There we go. Hopefully that will be a bit happier now. Okay, right. Okay, so we've got the zip the right length. We've got the fabric cut out to size. The next things we need to cut are the piping cord and the bias binding. So the piping cord and the bias binding both need to be roughly the same length. And what they need to be is the length of all 4 sides added together, plus about 10 centimetres for good measure. So I normally, obviously, if you know exactly, if you've got a 43 centimetre square piece of fabric, you can times that by 4 and cut out your piping cord and bias binding to that dimension plus 10 centimetres. Normally I just kind of plonk it down, get my bias binding and my piping cord, and then kind of, you know, measure it round 4 times, add about that much and snip it to size. So you want to do that for the piping cord and for the bias binding, so that you know that they're going to go all the way around the edge of your cushion cover. And you've got a bit extra so that you've got a bit of a, so we can make a nice neat overlap. So you're not going to see any of the raw edges at the end. Okay, so the first sewing step is a little bit of a time-consuming one, actually. Well, it's pinning first, but it is slightly time-consuming pinning job. So I have started it in advance so that you don't have to sit and watch me pin for ages. But if you get your bias binding, if you've made your own bias binding, this won't be the case. But if you purchased it, the 2 edges will be pressed in probably like that. It's sometimes also pressed in half, which is actually quite helpful in this case, but usually it's not. So you open up your bias binding like that. You place your piping cord in the middle, and then you fold the bias binding over, and then you want to pin the piping cord into the center of the folded in half bias all the way down like that. And it can be a little bit faffy, so just take your time. You might find it easier to press your bias binding open beforehand, because it's these bits which have been really kind of hard pressed in on the edges, which sometimes takes a little bit of time to get sorted. But that's what we want to do, is pin it all the way down, and then we're going to sew that in place. So what you'll end up with is a stitched piece of, can you see, of piping within your bias binding. So that is ultimately what's going to be the piping around the edge of the cushion. So if I just finish pinning this piece, and then I'll sew the bits that I've not already stitched. I'm doing it the wrong way around. Here we go. I want to go this way. But yeah, so that's what you want to do. And the reason that you want to use bias binding is so that when we get to the corners of the cushion, you can do a little bit of kind of stretching of the piping around the corner, very, very slightly. And it means that because the fabric, the bias binding is cut on the bias and it's got a bit of stretch to it, it will mean that your corners are going to be really nice and neat, and you won't have any puckers. I mean, if it's your first ever one, you definitely are going to have some puckers. Please don't worry about that. Everybody has on their first ones, but once you've done a couple, you won't have any puckers. You'll be a dab hand. Okay, so I've finished pinning down there, so I'm just going to stitch now with the zipper foot. And what we're going to do is stitch like this. I'm going to stitch with the zipper foot so that I'm really sewing as close as I can to the piping. The thing that you need to be really mindful of when you do this step is, so put quite a few pins in, because what can sometimes happen as you're sewing down, if you don't have a pin in, because you're kind of trying to push over and sew as close to the piping as possible, sometimes that can kind of start to move over and open up like that. So just take it nice and slow, make sure you have quite a few pins in, and just keep double checking that the 2 raw edges of the piping, of the bias binding down here, are lined up with each other. Okay, so let's change the foot back to the zipper foot on my sewing machine without my screwdriver, which I don't advise because it means you're not fitting it as tight as it should. Does anybody have any questions? Is it all making sense? Right, back to straight stitch. With this type of zipper foot, if you've got one of these. You might not have one like this, but with this kind of green screw on the back, you can unscrew that screw. So this is how it's fixed onto the prong that comes down that holds the presser foot. If you unscrew that screw, it means you can slide this bit across left or right. And so sometimes you might want to sew with a zip on that side, and sometimes you might want to sew with a zip on that side. So it means you can move the zipper foot across so that it's in the right place for you. So at the moment, this zipper foot's not quite in the right place. It's too far over. So I'm going to unscrew the back and move it along. If I just move my needle down slightly with the wheel, I can see where the needle is going to go down here. And I want the needle to be just in the little gap there. Not all the way in, because you don't want it to risk hitting that metal, but just in that little notch in the metal. And then once it's in the right place, you can tighten the green screw on the back of your zipper foot. So I'm happy now that that's in the right place. So if we pop the piping cord underneath, again, I did it on the wrong side. Sorry, I'm doing everything back to front. So I'll move it over to the other side. There we go. I'm using contrasting thread colours, but you'll have nice kind of coordinating thread colour. And actually, if you've got a different colour fabric to bias binding, it's better to match your thread colour to the bias colour than the fabric, because it will camouflage it a little bit better. Okay, so ready to go. So I just want to make sure that my stitching is nice and close. I'm kind of butting the stitches right up against the piping cord. And as I go, move the mic to the other side so you're closer to me, further away from my sewing machine. There we go. Yeah, as we go, just making sure that the two raw edges of the bias binding are staying lined up with each other. They're not kind of slipping open. So you want to do that all the way down the whole of the length of the piping and bias binding to join it all together into one length that's going to go all the way around the outside of your cushion. Okay. You can stop just before you get to the end, actually. So I'm just going to stop there because we're going to open that end up to do a nice, neat finish. Okay. There we go. One nice long length of piping cord. I'll just snip off the ends of thread from that join in the middle. And then what we need to do is add the piping to the front piece of the cushion cover. It might not matter. You might have two pieces of fabric that are exactly the same, in which case don't worry, but you might have a design which is different on the front to on the back. So you will have one side of your cushion which is neater than the other. So we're going to put the zip on the back, for example, so you won't see the zip on the front. It will just be a nice continuous square or rectangular piping on the front of the cushion, whereas on the back it's going to have the zip. And then the other thing to be mindful of, so we'll say that this is going to be the front for me. If you've got a directional fabric, you want to start and finish your piping and bias binding, your piping. So you don't want it along the top. So say you had a cushion on your bed or on your sofa, you wouldn't want the join of the piping to be along the top of your cushion. Equally, it's a bit tricky if you have it along the bottom because you've got the zip going back and forth and you don't want to risk the zip catching on that join of the piping. So the best place to start and finish your piping is towards the bottom on one of the side edges of the cushion. So if you've got non-directional fabric like this, it doesn't matter at all. But if you've got a design which has got a top on it, you just need to have a little think about that and make sure that you start and finish your piping towards the bottom on one of the two sides. Okay, so what we'll do, I don't need to worry about that for this piece of fabric because it's the same, you know, doesn't have a direction. But what we're going to do is line up the raw edge of the bias binding with the raw edge of the fabric and then start pinning it down. So I've got the right side of the fabric facing up. So I'm pinning the piping to the right side of the fabric with the raw edges facing. Let me just do one pin in and then I can show you and it will kind of make sense. But if you were to imagine that stitched in place and then I open it out, you can see that's what it's going to look like ultimately. So we just need to pin so I'm starting down one of the edges towards the bottom. We need to pin the piping all the way around the edges. Now, when you get to the corners, it's good to do a little snip in the seam allowance of the piping just to help you go around that corner. So I'm going to do a pin right up to that corner like this. So the corner of the fabric is just here. So I've done a pin right up to that corner. So this is where the corner is going to be. So let's kind of slightly stretch that round. But actually, if I take my scissors and just do a little snip, I don't want to snip the stitches that we've just made, but I just want to do a little snip in the seam allowance of the bias binding, and that will again just ease the piping around that corner. That's another little tip just to make it a little bit smoother so that when we ultimately open it out, we're going to have a slightly neater corner than otherwise. So let's keep pinning around and make sure you pull your piping reasonably taut. You don't want it to have like any bags or sags in it. There we go. So I'll keep pinning around. And again, my first pin is pretty much immediately after that corner, just to hold everything in place. Can you see it's slightly curved as well around that corner? So I'm going to be trying to sew at a bit of a right angle, but just the nature of this means that it's going to be very, very slightly curved. So you're never going to get it in fact, you wouldn't really want it to be a really sharp right angled corner. So let's keep pinning down. And then again, I'm going to do a pin pretty much right in that corner here. And then I'll take my scissors and do a little snip just in the seam allowance, not quite up to the sewing on the piping. And that just means that we can kind of stretch it and pull it around that corner a little bit more easily. Down the third side. Again, match up your raw edges of the fabric with the raw edges of the piping. Oops. And the next step after this, if you get comfortable doing this, is to make a box cushion with piping. They're so lovely. A really nice thing to make for like to go on a stool or in a window seat or something like that. I can I'll teach you how to do that next if you'd like. It's really fun. Not much trickier. I mean, you're not doing any steps differently. You know, you're not doing any new techniques that you're not doing here. I like thinking about what else you can do once you've learned one technique, how else you can apply it. Okay, so nearly there, down the final home straight. There we go, and put this pin up for the last corner, do a little snip. And then for this last edge, I'll pop a pin in here, but then I'm just going to stop pinning just before I get to where we started. And actually what we want to do, so I've got lots extra here, I was quite generous, is we want to, you want to start, so you should have a nice overlap like this of your piping and bias binding on either end. So I'm going to start probably about maybe 6 or 7 centimeters from the edge so that I can use the excess in this overlap to give us a really nice, clean and neat overlap once I finished sewing. So I'm going to start my stitching probably about here. So I'll go back over to the sewing machine again. We've still got the piping, the zipper foot, sorry, in the machine. Okay. And put it under there. So actually, I'm going to move you over this way a little bit better. There we go. So I've got my zipper foot here. The stitching is going to go down. The needle is going to go down on the left-hand side of the zipper foot in this bit here. So my zipper foot's holding the piping down onto the fabric, and the stitching is going to be butted up really nice and close to the piping cord. So I'll take that first pin out, and it takes a little bit of practice to do this. So you might want to have a bit of a practice first of all with a you know, like an offcut of piping cord that you sew into some bias binding. But let's have a little start. I'll do a bit of reverse. So I'm trying to keep my stitching nice and close to the piping. And then when we get down to the corner here, where that nick that I cut into the edge of the piping is, I'm going to stop about there with my needle down into the fabric, lift up my presser foot, pivot around. You might want to do one stitch kind of on that diagonal, which I sometimes do, well, I always do with the manually, with the wheel on the right hand side of my sewing machine. And then I find that if you do one stitch on the diagonal rather than trying to kind of get a right angle, it just ends up looking a little bit neater. So, and then we facing in the right direction again, and off we go down this side. So you've got to beat this again. The main thing to be mindful of here is put your pins quite close together and just double check that as you're sewing down, you don't accidentally start veering off in towards the center of the fabric, you know, so you all the time your raw edges of fabric are lined up with the raw edges of the piping, yet you're keeping your stitching nice and close to the piping cord. There we go. If you find that you have mispinned, and that say when you get you might find that when you get to a corner that your fabric has slipped, one's quicker than the other, and this corner nick that you've made actually was maybe a couple of centimeters up here by the time you get to your corner, especially if you've got a rectangular cushion, you've got a longer piece of sewing to do. Don't worry about that. Just make a new little nick in the seam allowance of the piping, and then it just means you'll have to readjust your pins as you keep going round, but that's okay, so don't worry about it. Okay, I'm going to sew pretty much up to that little cut I made. Let's go on the diagonal, do 1 stitch, and then face in the new direction down here. Sometimes I've tried teaching it this so that you don't put all the pins in, just in case you do have some slippage like that, but it's much easier if you do put all the pins in. But once you get a little bit more, you know, you've got a few under your belt, you might want to see if you find it easier without putting all the pins in at the beginning. It's completely up to you. Okay. So nearly there. Is this the last one? Oh, penultimate. So pretty much down to the corner. And then we're going to do 1 on the diagonal. Oops. And then down here. Once you've made, so I can make a piped cushion in probably about half an hour now. So once you've made a few, you'll find that you can do them really quickly. The main job is making, the most time consuming job is making that piping at the beginning. That's not, I wouldn't be able to do it in that speed if I was making my own bias binding, by the way. Definitely takes a bit longer. Okay, last corner. 1 on the diagonal. Actually, let me do a couple. I think I was a bit short on that one. And then what we're going to do is I'm just going to do a few centimeters down here. And then I'm going to stop about here, do a little bit of reverse. And then we can do our lovely join. So there we go. Look, I have to show you. So that's what it's going to look like. Oh my gosh, it's so satisfying. Honestly, there's something about these little techniques that look very professional that actually aren't too tricky. If you just take your time, do it methodically, very satisfying. And piped cushions cost a fortune, and you don't need that much because there's no overlap of the fabric. So literally just 2 squares of fabric. You can, if you're looking like the off-cut bins and things like that, you can pick up really lovely fabric, not too expensive, and make a very premium looking cushion for not much at all. It's really good. Okay, let me show you the how to make a nice neat overlap. So if I'm going to peel back the piping cord from the bias binding. Ultimately, we want the 2 ends of the piping cord to butt up against each other so that we've got a nice smooth edge of piping cord, but we're going to have an overlap of the bias binding to kind of conceal and keep those 2 ends of the piping cord butted up against each other. Now, I don't think I can see a unpicker, which is helpful. Okay, so that one ends there. This one is too long at the moment, so I'm going to cut this one so that there's an overlap of about 4 to 5 centimeters of the 2. And then what we want to do is open up both of the, I can't even find my embroidery scissors. Sorry, this isn't very, it's probably right next to me, but hey ho. I'm just going to open up that bias binding. So what we've got is something that looks a bit like this. Like, so you can see both of the ends of the piping cord, and they're kind of opened up with the bias binding. So first of all, you can either just snip, kind of slice straight through both of the bits of piping cord like this, because you know that then they're going to butt up against each other, or you can do them individually if you're more comfortable. But if you do it like that, then we know that those two pieces of piping cord meet each other here, because I've sliced through them with one nice clean cut. Then you need to decide which of the pieces of bias binding you want to be on the outside. So I'm going to do this one. Actually, no, I'm going to do this one here because I've done that one a bit closer. So the piece of bias binding that's going to be closest, like kind of on the outside edge, you need to fold over by about 1 centimetre. Like that. So if you imagine then on the correct side of the fabric, we're not going to have any raw edges. It's going to be a nice folded edge. Oops, this way around. And then, actually, I'm going to go this way around. It's going to be easier for you to see. So I've got a nice folded edge of this one, and then I'm going to trim this one. So it's just going to sit inside the other one. So there we go. I'm just going to show you again a little bit more close up so that you can see. Oh, I'm just going to open this one a little bit more. It's making life a bit tricky. There we go. Okay, so one of them, the one that's going to be on the closest to the cushion, I'm going to fold about 1 centimetre in like that, and then sit the other one with the raw edge just inside or on top of that one, like that. And then both of the two bits of piping cord need to sit on top of the two pieces of bias and just butt up against each other. And then if you fold everything back in, you'll see that the join in the piping is really nice and neat. It's this little fold here. So I've got no raw edges. Nothing's going to start fraying. Nothing's going to be catching, and everything is caught inside. Was that clear? Yeah, okay. Right, I'm going to pop a little pin in there. And then you can just take it back to the sewing machine. Oops. And just sew that little bit. So I'm going to start here, finish there, go over my stitching a little bit so that we've sewn all the way around. Sorry, all the way around the piping. I'll trim all these raw edges in a minute. Is that okay? There you go. Okay, I'll do the first couple of stitches manually. Do a little bit of reverse because we don't want this coming undone. There we go. Oh, haven't quite got back to where I started. Let's do a couple more stitches. There we are. Okay, so piping is now attached all the way around the cushion, all four sides, and we've got that nice neat join as well. So that's going to be lovely. Next thing we need to do is just trim off any of the raw, the ends of the threads to make sure that they don't get in our way for the next step. And the next thing we need to do is attach the zip. Okay, so can you remember before we had the piping join towards the bottom on one of the side edges? So ours is down here. So what we're going to do is make sure that you're attaching the zip, if you've got directional fabric, along the bottom edge of your front of your cushion piece. If it doesn't matter if it's directional, just make sure it's not on the same edge as that join. Okay, so we've cut the zip to the right size. So you want to open the zip out about halfway and then place the zip down. And again, what you want to be thinking about is lining, so it's right sides together. So this is the right side of the fabric facing upwards and the right side of the zip facing downwards. So this is the wrong side of the zip facing me. And again, what we want to think about is lining up the raw edges of the fabric. So when we sew this, we want to sew it so that the raw edges are pretty much, well, actually on this one, they are exactly touching each other. And again, I'm just going to do a little pin in just to show you so that you can go the next step ahead in your mind and understand what's happening. So our line of stitching along this side is going to go down here. Then if I open that out, you can see that the zip will then be kind of, obviously you're not going to use a pink zip with blue fabric, but just so that you can see a bit more clearly. Our zip's going to be like this, just inside this line of this edge of piping. So you want to center everything. So if you find the center point of your fabric, I might do a tiny little snip actually, just so that I can see where that is. And then find the center point of your zip, which I'm not going to cut. I'll just pop a pin in, which is there. And then I'll do it on the other side. Oops. And then line up those two center points like this. And then exactly as I said, so right side of zip facing down, right side of fabric facing up, and then line up the raw edges. So your stitching line is going to be butted up against the piping and also butted up against the teeth of the zip. So they're kind of both against each other in this bit here, in this sort of ditch here. Can you see? So I'll pin all the way along. This is probably the fiddliest bit, isn't it? There might be one other bit that's a little bit more fiddly. I don't want to say. And then you should have a little gap either side for the corners, one there and one there. So what I'm going to go is take the fabric over to my sewing machine and start my sewing actually about just where the metal starter for the teeth of the zip is, and then stop where either the metal stopper or my newly created stitched stopper for the teeth of the zip is. So again, you've got the zipper foot on your sewing machine. I think every step is, yeah, we have the zipper foot on all the way for this project, so you don't actually use the standard regular zipper foot, the regular presser foot at all. Okay, so I'm going to start my sewing here. So just about the point, so the stopper of my zip is pretty much in line with where my sewing is going to start. So pop the needle down, do a few stitches first, forwards and back. And then you can start stitching down, take the pins out as you go. And it does make life much easier using the zipper foot, because it just means that there's no way that you can sew over the piping cord and the zip, because the zipper foot is just not going to let you do that. You keep stitching. I'm going to open the zip a little bit further actually, because it's easier to sew this bit rather than below the zip, the puller of the zip. So when you get to just before the zipper pull, it's about 3/4 of the way down, put your needle down into your fabric, lift up your presser foot, and then move the zip to behind where you've already stitched. And then you can carry on. And by doing that, it means that at no point do you have to try and negotiate your way around the puller of the zip. You can just keep sewing in a nice straight line all the way down. And you don't have a little wonky line where you're going around the zip pull. Okay, I'm just going to carefully hold it in place for this last little bit. And then finish my sewing pretty much where the that new stopper that we sewed for the zip is. Sorry, I can't see where my cutter is. Okay, so it's starting to take shape. There's not that much more to do. So the zip is now attached to the front of the cushion. And so before we attach the cushion back around each of the sides, we just need to first of all attach the other side of the zip to the cushion back. So where's my cushion back gone? Down here. Okay. There we go. So I'm going to have the fabric facing right side facing up. And then if you take your back piece of fabric, and again, if it is directional, make sure that you remember to have the bottom on the side where the zip is, because that's going to be the bottom of our cushion if it is directional. And again, so you've got right sides facing each other. And again, you want to line up the raw edge of the fabric with the raw edge of the zip up here. So if I turn it round like this, so this is the wrong side of the zip. This raw edge here is going to line up with the raw edge of the fabric. And you need to make sure that you are centering everything again. So it's all going to line up nicely. So if I pop one pin in, again, I'll pop a couple in actually, and then again, that will just kind of help you, and I'll open the fabric out and you can just get clear in your head what this next line of stitching does. So I've popped a couple of pins in where that sewing line is going to be. So if I was to open up that fabric, you'll see that ultimately what's going to happen here is, so that's the front of our cushion, that's the back, and they're going to be joined up here along the zip side, which is what's going to form the bottom. So again, you want to make sure that you, when you've got a cushion pad in here, this kind of all puffs out a little bit, but you'd want your zip to be a nice complementary colour rather than a contrasting colour. Right, let's pin that all the way along. Actually, what I could do, I might do another little nick in the fabric and just join those both up, because that was quite a good way of getting the center. So there is the center of the front lined up with the center of the back. Okay. So it's easier for you to sew on the zip side rather than the fabric side, because then you're going to be able to see where the teeth of the zip are, and you can make sure that you're sewing nice and close to the teeth of the zip and you're not kind of veering off. So if you turn your fabric over, again, you want to open it about 3/4 of the way like this, and you'll find it much easier to sew down here with your stitching butted up against the teeth of the zip. If you're to try and sew on this side, you have to kind of sort of feel your way as to where the teeth of the zip are. So it's much more tricky. So it's easier to just sew on the zip side rather than the fabric side. Okay, a couple more pins. Okie doke. So there we go. So that's pinned. So we've got the front of the fabric, the zip, and then the back of the fabric over here. But make sure you have the zip, like I say, about 3/4 of the way open. So back over to the sewing machine. And again, let's start the sewing where the zip pull see that okay? And just make sure you've got the best view where the zip pull starts. Do a couple of stitches by hand, bit of reverse, and then we'll start sewing down. Make sure that your stitches are, you don't want the stitches to be touching the teeth of the zip, but you want them to be, I don't know, maybe 2 millimeters away. Right, I'm nearly at the puller, the zip pull. So I've put my needle down, lifted my presser foot up, and I'm going to push the zip pull to behind where we've already sewn. And then this is much, much easier now to sew with the zip open. So, I'm sorry, I'm veering off course a bit because I'm not sitting as squarely to my machine as I normally would. But you get the idea. Oops. And then again, stop your stitching pretty much where that metal stopper is for the top of the zip. Okay, one more piece of sewing and then we're done. Oh, sorry. So let's now turn our fabric so that it's right sides facing. Here we go. And you must make sure to keep your zip about, well, actually, it doesn't really matter this time. So maybe about half open, half closed. Just at this point, do a little check and make sure that the zip opens and closes nice and freely. You've got no stitches which are too close to your zipper pulls. If you have, you might need to unpick them and redo them. And you might want to press the fabric away from the teeth of the zipper at this point as well. If you do that, just be really careful, because if you've got plastic teeth, which you probably have, you just need to make sure that you don't get the iron right on the teeth, because you might melt them, which is an absolute disaster. You don't actually need to press at this point, because once you've got the cushion pad in the cushion, it will pull it all out nicely anyway. But let's have the zip about halfway open or closed, depending on your point of view. And then fold the fabric over so that it's right sides together all the way around. And then if you flip your fabric over, so this is the front piece of the fabric facing upwards, this is really, really going to help you, because you've actually already got a line of stitching all the way around the outside of the cushion from where you attached the piping cord to the cushion front first time round. So we can use that as a guide this time to make sure that we're stitching, that we know that the stitching is going to be up close to the piping cord. So it's really, really helpful to use that. So lay your fabric on top of itself. You want to really make sure that the corners are lined up with each other. You might need to, because on this side, it's easy for this one side to kind of go a bit like that. And then because you've got the zip up here, which is adding a little bit extra length, which would mean that one of them is a little bit longer than the other. So it's important to match up all of the corners so that this edge here with that extra piece of zip in there is kind of going vertically upwards. And then once you're happy that the corners are lining up with each other, we need to pin again around the 4 corners outside of the piping cord. So the piping cord is in there, and this is just the flat seam allowance out here. So let's pin all the way around. matching up the corners. I'll match this one up first so I know it's going to be in the right place. And match up your raw edges so everything's nice and square. So again, I'll just match up this corner first. And then go in and fill in the gaps with some more pins. Lining up the raw edges. Oops. 1, 2. And then the last one here. So we're not going to do any stitching on the edge that the zip is on because the fabric's already sewn together on that edge, albeit on either side of the zip, but we don't need to do any more stitching on that side. It's just the other 3 edges. So the 2 sides and the top, basically, that don't have the zip attached to them. Okay. So what we're going to do is sew all the way around these 3 edges. But when we start and stop, so you're going to start here at the bottom of the zip and you'll end here at the top of the zip. What I usually do is I kind of pull these bits of the zip, so the flappy end bits above the stopper, I kind of tuck those, what will be, to the middle of the zip actually, but the middle of the cushion, I mean, but at the moment they're towards the kind of the outside edge. Fold them like that and then pop another pin in. And ideally, we want to start, oh, we've got another one. We want to start and stop our line of stitching. And again, you've got sewing here for guidance. That piece of stitching there is where the sewing stopped for us to attach the zip to the front piece of the fabric. So what we want to do is start our sewing about there and then follow this line of stitching. So just sew over the top of it, or even, so you don't want to sew outside towards the seam allowance. You want to sew either on this line of stitching that we've already done, or if possible, even very, very slightly closer to the piping cord, because this is our final line of stitching that's going to go around the 3 sides. And so what we want to try and do is avoid seeing any of the previous stitches that we've done. So if we can go on that line of stitching or even slightly closer to the piping cord, it means that you're going to end up with the neatest possible finish once you've turned your cushion right side out. So yeah, tuck those up. Started there. We're going to sew all the way around, and then if I get back to where we're going to finish, I'll do the same thing. I'll pull those 2 little stopper bits from the zip upwards, away from the cushion cover, and just pop another little pin in there so that we can try and make sure it's nice and neat at the end. Okay, so last piece of sewing now. Take the fabric back to the sewing machine and just take your time. Sometimes, and I'll show you when I've finished sewing and I open the cushion out, sometimes I think, oh, I could have gone a little bit neater there. So occasionally I've done a couple of hand stitches once I finished it and turned it the right side out, just to make sure it's nice and neat. But you might be absolutely fine. You might not need to do that. So let's pop this underneath the presser foot. Can take that first pin out now. Make sure that the edges of your zip are facing outwards. I'm just going to go up a bit. There we go. Right, press the foot down. And I'm going to try my best to go on that, at least on that line of stitching that we've already done, that we can see. So and we'll do the same as what we did the first time round. So get pretty much up to the corner. And I'm really kind of pushing my stitching up to the piping cord now. So first corner, let's do 1 diagonal stitch. And then keep going down the Other side. Well, that's where my piping join is. I've got a few more bits of stitching there, but hopefully nice and neat. Pretty much up to the corner. One diagonal. And then the next side. One more. There's a quick diagonal. Actually, I think I was a bit premature. There's one more. And then down, where are we? Oh, last edge. Suddenly had a panic that my bobbin thread had run out, but I think we're okay. It's the worst thing, isn't it? Absolutely the worst. So right up to the corner. One diagonal. And then just this little bit here, we need to do a few stitches up to where the zip first starts. So be a bit careful because at some point in here you've got the metal stopper. So I'm going to switch to sewing manually. I think I can afford one more stitch and then do a little bit of reverse. So if you sew manually, it just means that if you're going to hit that zip, that metal stopper on the zip, that you find out about it before your machine stitches into it. And then that's it, all done. So what you can do, I'd advise you to just double check. So turn it right side out first of all, but as long as you're happy, you can trim the corners of the cushion if you want to. But let's have a look at the reveal. So we started obviously with it half open. So that is really important because otherwise you won't be able to open your cushion. Turn it right side out. Let's turn it out. Oh, it's so satisfying. I love it. You might want something pointy. Oh my God, honestly. You must share this moment with me, all of you, because I want to see. You're lovely. Honestly. Never gets old. Look. There we go. Isn't that lovely? So pleased every time. So here, these bits here we should be able to tuck those in. And actually, I think I probably will do a couple more stitches there. This side we're good. That's lovely and neat. Let me show you. So I've turned that corner out. So that edge, that's nice and neat. I'm happy with that. But I think probably up this edge, I could do a couple more stitches. I mean, it's not bad. There's a tiny little gap there. Can you see? So I'd probably hand stitch a couple of stitches in there just to make sure that that's nice. Or I could plonk it under the machine again, turn it back round and do a couple more stitches, but I'd probably just use the wheel. But otherwise, there we go. Oh my word. How satisfying. Isn't it a joy? Oh. Right. I think I've told you all the tips. Has anybody got any questions? And how are we doing? Oh, I can show you if you like how to make some bias binding quickly as well, if you'd like me to. Right, any questions on any of that stuff that I've just told you? Obviously, if you have any questions outside of when you're sewing it yourselves, then you can ask me then. Anything now? No? Anne, how did you get on? Are you sewing? You stopped? No. Okay. You're there with your machine, so I was like, how's she doing? Right, let me show you some quickly how you'd do your actually I've got all right, I'm not going to show you the really quick way now. I've got a nice way of showing you how to do a reasonable amount of piping cord bias binding out of a fat quarter. I'll email you that because I've got a nice little quick tutorial on that. But essentially what you do otherwise is you take your fabric. It would be much larger piece than this. You'd have too many joins if it was a piece like this, but say 1/2 meter or whatever, or the fat quarter, if I show you the fat quarter method, you need to fold it at right angles. So you need to make sure that you're folding it directly on the bias. And then like that, or if you've got a cutting mat like this, as long as the fabric is lined up with the grid of the mat, you can cut on the diagonal. Let's check. Is that there? Yeah. Okay. So you just cut strips and then you'd measure along. Oops. Measure along, cut the next one. You just pretend I was doing it the exact width of my ruler because that's going to be easier to show you. And you just keep cutting strips like this at a consistent. Oh, I need a new blade on my rotary cutter. Oh, it's much easier with a rotary cutter and with a board and a metal ruler actually, but obviously you can do it with scissors if you don't have one. And then once you've got a few strips, when you join them, you want to join so that you've got right sides facing and you cross over like this so that you've got about 1 centimetre seam allowance, and that centimetre crossover point is there like that. And then if I just take it over to the machine, I'll just quickly sew a line up here. I'll just do it with my zipper put on still quickly. Oops. And then you would just open it out, press open that seam there, and you'd have a few joins, of course, but the larger the piece of fabric that you started off with, the fewer joins you'd have, and then you can just snip those 2 corners off. And then yeah, and then you have one nice long continuous piece of bias which has a bit of stretch on it, so it has loads and loads of different uses. It's really handy, and it's lovely sometimes to have you know, patterned bias. You can use more premium fabrics than the ones that you might be able to find with bias binding that you can buy off the shelf. But yeah, that's just a handy thing to know how to do as well. Right, I think, let me see. So I've never actually used a piping foot, Peter. I might check. I've probably got one because I've got loads of feet. I've not used all of them. So I can't speak to, I don't know so much about that. Let me have a little look into it. I've probably got one, so I'll include some details on that in my email if you like, when I reply to you, when I send out the recording and the workbook this evening. Sorry, I can't tell you anything about that now. Anything else? Okay, so I will download the transcript, the recording